Good morning. Yay. So one of the values, that is ethical standards, by that is values, ethical standards of this workshop is that we start on time and we end on time. And that's what we're going to do for this wonderful session. So I've said good morning already. My name is Risa Pong, and I'm a professor of urban studies and geography at Georgia State University. I feel particularly connected to the Hazard Center and this workshop, this conference, because I spent 14 years as a faculty member at CU Boulder. I was in the geography department, and I attended some of, not the very first one, but some of the very early workshops in the late 1970s. But it's an honor for me, truly, it's an honor for me to introduce this plenary session. As you know, this session sets the basic argument for the workshop, making the moral case for mitigation. This is an important but often neglected topic. Making the moral case for studying or funding or implementing hazard mitigation is quite different from the more common argument of making the financial case for mitigation based on cost-benefit analysis and the calculation in dollars of what would be saved. Hazard mitigation can, of course, be justified as a financial decision, but it also springs from valuing, protecting people, from moral considerations, from valuing people's communities, from valuing people's artifacts, not only in the present, but also for future generations. Ethical mitigation means attention to the well-being of those who are especially vulnerable. Ethical mitigation demands that we do the right thing for the right reasons. In thinking about this session, I could not help but remember the work and the personal influence on me of Gilbert White, the founder of the Hazard Center. I was fortunate to have met Gilbert when I was a fairly junior faculty member coming to CU, and I was so influenced, profoundly influenced by his modesty, his generosity, his kindness, and the tremendous contributions that he made to our field. His legacy lives on through the directors that have followed him, and I would say especially through Lori Peak, who with her staff has put together these very inspiring themes for this workshop. Can we give her a round of applause? This panel of distinguished leaders was asked to think about how mitigation represents an ethical imperative and also expresses the core values of a community. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce today's panel. David Applegate is the 18th director of the U.S. Geological Survey, having been sworn in August of 2022. He earned his PhD, yes. He earned his PhD in geology at MIT. Previously, he served as the Associate Director for Natural Hazards from 2011 to 2021, leading the USGS's, United States Geological Survey's emergency response activities and overseeing the Bureau's geologic hazards and coastal and marine programs. David joined the USGS in 2004 as the first senior science advisor for earthquake and geologic hazards. In an earlier interview, he stated that his work, that is, translating science for the public, policymakers, and the media to maximize its impact in reducing losses, gives him a sense of mission and purpose. Lauren Alexander Augustine is the executive director for the Gulf Research Program for the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. She's responsible for overseeing all aspects of management and the use of criminal settlement funds from the Deepwater Horizon disaster that were entrusted with the national academies by the federal government. She's worked at the National Academy since 2002 and served as director of the Resilient America program, which supports communities' efforts to build resilience to extreme events using science and diverse stakeholder engagement. Her PhD is from Harvard University. Eric Letvin is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Mitigation at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. His areas of oversight include pre- and post-disaster mitigation programs that support sustainable, disaster-resilient communities. Before joining FEMA, Eric was the Director of Hazard Mitigation and Risk Reduction Policy with National Security Program, advising the President in the mitigation mission area. His master's degree is from Syracuse University, and he also holds a JD from the University of Maryland, Baltimore. Patty Hernandez is co-founder and executive director of Headwaters Economics, an independent nonprofit research group that helps improve community development and management decisions, but makes complex data understandable, beautiful, and interactive. Patty has had 18 years of experience in researching economic development, building partnerships, and developing technology solutions to help communities plan and adapt to a changing world. Her master's degree is in ecology. And in this order, I'm going to call on each panelist to speak for about 15 minutes, and we will reserve some time at the end of the session for questions and discussion. So, David?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Risa, and thank you all for the opportunity to speak today and to be a part of this important gathering, now again in person, continuing the long tradition of bringing together researchers and practitioners dedicated to the critical work of keeping our nation's communities safe, resilient, and prosperous in the face of growing risk from natural hazard events. And is reflected by the theme of this workshop, a commitment to reaching those most vulnerable to the impacts of these events. And I just want to acknowledge the incredible session last evening, Judy Mitrani-Reiser's EERI Distinguished Lecture on all that these communities have done to learn from earthquakes and to apply that broadly. And then, of course, the amazing keynote that we just had that helping us take that moment to think. That was quite extraordinary kickoff. So both did a great job of getting us going for this theme. I'm going to speak to you this morning wearing two hats. The first being my role as director of the U.S. Geological Survey, which is the science arm of the Department of the Interior. And I also co-chair the Interagency Science for Disaster Reduction Working Group, which operates under the auspices of the National Science and Technology Council to bring together agencies both producing science and those using science to advance disaster risk reduction. Both for the USGS and for the interagency, issues of equity and disaster risk reduction have been of keen interest. Certainly the Biden-Harris administration with their series of executive orders. I know there's a session later on to talk about the Justice 40 initiative. All of this has provided, let's say, additional impetus and top cover for what has been already a tremendous amount of grassroots interests across our scientists, engineers, and others in this space. And so a lot of what I'll be talking about are things that really bubbled up, but I think we're very much in the spirit of what we're seeing across the administration. Science and engineering studies help decision makers and planners determine where and how to build, what structures to reinforce, and what preparedness actions to socialize in a given community. They help provide the numbers and analysis used to justify and prioritize investments. But we know that the value of building a disaster resilient society goes far beyond what can easily be captured in a cost-benefit analysis. And what we need that we need to widen the aperture to ensure that the benefits of mitigation are accruing to all communities. The USGS is committed to delivering actionable information for a wide array of natural hazards in a form that can be used, and to which I would add, by those who need it the most. And I do mean a wide array of hazards. For some, we're the direct source for public information, and for others, we're the eyes and ears for our good friends at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And of course, the work we do very much supports FEMA and emergency management at the local, state, and tribal levels. And we do this, this dot triangle here reflects that in all these hazards, we're providing foundational data, and then we combine that with expertise to be able to enable us to provide real-time situational awareness for response, but also long-term hazard and risk assessments that can support mitigation. We know we can't respond our way out of disasters, hence the importance of mitigation. But how do you make those hazards real enough to people to inspire action before the event? In our quest to deliver actionable information, we recognize that it's not sufficient to focus on hazard alone, but instead is crucial to incorporate the human element with an additional focus on risk in order to make the information real enough so that it will inspire action and ultimately change the outcomes of disasters. This has meant building partnerships with affected communities through co-development of science and participatory research, as well as with the social science community, including many of those at this workshop, as well, and indeed bringing social scientists into the USGS to help us with the translation. Our strategic focus area on reducing risk posed by all types of disruptions, including geohazards, contaminants, invasive species, and climate change. We do this guided by a plan published in 2018. We call this the Science for a Risky World plan. It's a bureau-wide roadmap to ensure that USGS information on hazards is delivered and incorporated into risk assessments and other products that can be used by decision makers to reduce loss. And by the way, the person tasked with implementing this plan is my replacement as the USGS Associate Director for Natural Hazards, Mike Grimm, who joined us 2 months ago after a distinguished career at FEMA, but he started his career at the USGS. So I want to acknowledge Mike. He's a familiar figure to many of you, and we're very pleased to have him with us. As part of implementation of the plan, we recognize that successful risk reduction is a combination of science-based hazard, vulnerability, and exposure assessments, meaningful and strategic stakeholder engagement, and the delivery of actionable information. We also recognize that USGS hazards information can only be applied to reduce risk when it's developed for and delivered to decision makers who need it, when they need it, and how they need it. This requires expertise in social science disciplines such as risk communication and evaluation. And it all relies on a strong foundation of inclusive stakeholder engagement to ensure that project design and final products are informed by and meet stakeholder needs. By focusing on science for risk reduction and community resilience, we're building capacity in these skill sets through training and engaging with partners at federal, state, local, and tribal levels, as well as in academia. And as part of this effort, we're also pursuing new directions, including a new focus on risk reduction and social equity. This has included activities to identify the needs of underserved communities that the USGS can address, determine our role in engaging these communities, develop a broader awareness of hazards impact, and identify mechanisms to improve the delivery of our information to them. Some of the projects that have helped lay the groundwork for this focus include the Science Application for Risk Reduction project with its large-scale scenarios addressing cascading consequences, and the Strategic Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment project. We well know, first off, that this focus on risk has really provided an outlet for grassroots interest across our workforce in diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. We well know that not all people in the United States experience disasters in the same way, and often underserved communities fare far worse in the face of disasters than do their well-resourced and well-served counterparts. As members of the natural hazards community, we must challenge ourselves to do a better job of ensuring that critical hazards information reaches those underserved communities in actionable, relevant, and accessible ways. By doing so, we arm these communities with information that can be used to better protect those who may be most vulnerable during a hazard event. For the USGS, this takes many forms. For example, some of the images here, building long-term collaborations with communities on the Big Island of Hawaii with respect to our longstanding collaboration there in volcano hazards, engaging coastal tribes in Alaska as they face the significant shift in the hazard associated with coastal erosion and extreme events, and engaging the next generation both with STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and STEAM, throwing arts into the mix and some of the work that we're doing in a number of our science centers. An example of co-production of knowledge and meeting people where they are is the work that we've been doing with the Natural Hazards Center here at UC Boulder and with the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez. When Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico in 2017, it triggered more than 70,000 landslides across the island, disrupting transportation routes, dislodging homes from their foundations on steep hillsides, and causing both direct and indirect loss of life. In the wake of the hurricane, community leaders and decision makers in Puerto Rico reached out to the USGS for help. And in response, we worked with these partners and the university to develop scientific products like the Puerto Rico Landslide Susceptibility Map and municipal level susceptibility maps. But also working jointly with the communities, we prepared a suite of layperson-friendly outreach and educational materials on landslide hazards to complement the technical materials. And we found champions in local media and in a community representation to help carry the message. These products were developed in Spanish first, then translated to English to ensure the broadest possible readership. The goal was to highlight the need to support education of residents and emergency managers about the landslide risk and help communities become more resilient. We've since expanded this work in Puerto Rico with coastal communities looking at storm erosion hazards, as well as earthquakes following the extended sequence in 2020 that rattled the southern coastal communities for many, many months. We have a number of project-specific successes in this area, but we know we can do more to put equity at the center of our work. And our interests in equity at the USGS are mirrored at other federal science agencies. So recognizing this collective interest across the federal interagency, we've used the Science for Disaster Reduction Interagency Working Group as a forum to not only learn from one another what efforts were underway, but to try to get at this question. How do we ensure that equity is centered in mitigation and in the research that underlies our mitigation activities? SDR issued a call for information to all federal agencies involved in disaster risk reduction activities to understand what work they were currently doing to integrate equity into their activities, what barriers they experienced, and what opportunities they saw for furthering equity in this space. We're hoping that a report pulling all this together will be coming out in the coming months. But for now, I'll just share two key messages that repeatedly arose through these discussions. And the first of these is the geographies, knowledge, priorities, and lived experiences of those living within underserved communities must play a central role in hazards research going forward. To effectively deploy disaster risk reduction programs and initiatives to meet the needs of underserved communities, federal agencies must ensure that these communities play a central role in the formation of such programs and initiatives. Centering equity and scientific research that will inform mitigation means participatory research methods and community engagement to understand the questions that underserved communities are trying to answer and to ensure that traditional knowledge is integrated into our analyses. This work requires coordination by federal agencies to reduce participation fatigue and undue burdens on the communities that we seek to partner with as we move ahead in these efforts. Putting equity front and center can also mean considering where we place monitoring stations, where we perform our in-depth research, and the coverage of decision support tools and modeling efforts. All of these can push equity forward as well. ensuring that we're doing research in these communities, including rural areas, areas where populations may have lower than average incomes, as well as in U.S. territories, Hawaii and Alaska, can supply critical data that may currently be missing, data that could inform hazard mitigation in these places. Who we partner or collaborate with can either amplify underrepresented voices or continue to subvert them. Carefully considering who we include on advisory committees or work with on research initiatives is yet another way that we as federal agencies can integrate equity into the work that we do every day. And centering the communities we seek to serve in the whole arc of the research process ensures that when we're developing this information, it's the information that's needed. The second key message is that we must evaluate our efforts to ensure we're actually advancing equity and providing science to mitigate disaster events. Expanding our research partnership scopes and the participation of underserved communities can and should advance equity in the development and delivery of hazards information. However, we might not and probably will not get it right the first time, which is why evaluating our work is so critical. It's important to get a sense of whether what we're doing is working. Carrying out these evaluations in partnerships with the communities that are affected is one way to iteratively improve and make sure we're meeting the mark. Additionally, the evaluations we carry out must take into account non-monetary issues. While understanding the cost of disaster in terms of property damage and business disruption is helpful, understanding proportionate loss to households is also key. The loss of someone's $1 million vacation home is very different than the loss of someone's modest primary residence, and that reflects a different set of factors. Understanding losses to cultural and ecological resources that are key to community well-being and survival is important to telling a complete story and understanding if we're moving the needle on these losses with our research. There's currently a large effort out there to led by the Office of Management Budget to look at natural capital accounting. And one aspect of that is as it relates, natural assets relate to disaster risk reduction. Again, trying to get at these things that are difficult to count, difficult to measure. The Subcommittee on Resilience, Science and Technology of the NSTC is working on that. One example is, I mentioned the SAFER project and the scenarios that have been developed with multidisciplinary teams of scientists, academics, and practitioners. And what you see here is a newly published evaluation report exploring the presence of these scenarios in cultures of preparedness and their role in mitigation and disaster risk reduction. They developed a mixed method studies to look at qualitative interviews, data collection of media and academic engagement, and examples of how the SAFER scenario is planning. And I wanted to highlight another session that's going to be taking place looking specifically at the Haywired scenario. I think this is on Wednesday, with insights from diversifying Haywired communications projects. So encourage folks to see that. So when SDR published its Grand Challenges document back in 2005, this was the end state here is what was described as envisioned, what we could do if we could meet and address these challenges. We can point to many steps in taking us in the right direction, but we also know that the goalposts have been moving, the scale of disasters has been growing. And in our interagency discussions, we've looked at some of the barriers to collaborating with and serving underserved communities at the federal level, policies that inhibit easy engagement with the public and policies that keep federal employees, for example, to be able to pay for some of the time and efforts of those we want to engage. We still have a long way to get there, but by focusing on people and better delivery of our science to those who need it most, we can help move forward. We must do this not simply because it's the right thing to do, but also because it has the potential to vastly expand the kinds of science and knowledge that we produce and ensure that these underserved communities get their fair share of the positive impacts that science can provide. At its heart, this is what it means to be a public good. Thank you.
That's great. Is it up? Good. Well, hello and good morning, everybody. It's always a little daunting but always a pleasure and an honor to follow Dave Applegate. It's not many people who let me go second alphabetically. So I want to thank you for that. I do love the USGS too. One, for the good work, but two, I also did my postdoc there at the Water Resources Division, not the WRD, Lori. So it's just where you get to just do the science, which is great. But now I'm at the National Academies where we don't, we get to do some science, but we really are in that second handoff phase that David talked about, the distilling, the translation, the advising, the facilitating, the application. And at the Gulf Research Program, which I will refer to as the GRP because I'm going to run out of time, we actually apply it in a specific place. And I'm going to talk about that specific place as we talk about a moral and ethical way of bringing science to mitigation. So this talk has 5 parts, just to keep you on track. It's not, hard, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the science and moral ethical mitigation in the scientific way. We're going to talk about mitigation at this local level, right, where I work in a specific place. And David hinted at it, and Michael Paul Nelson this morning really talked about bringing the people in, and that is the critical step in getting at this ethical and moral piece, because you have to get all these voices in. And I'm going to talk about something that I refer to as the zipper. This is coming out of a lot of the resilience work at the National Academies. And then finally, how the Gulf of Mexico is in fact an excellent zipper. So that's it, okay? So getting started here, we talk about applying science to decision-making, policy-making, all these kinds of things. But when you're actually in the mix, when you're in the cut, right, you get some uncomfortable questions. It's not just about doing good science, which we all strive to do. We get confronted. Listen, I'm a physical scientist. I'm like a triple dipped engineer. So the social science stuff is not my first language, but we do get these questions about mitigating for whom? Who's doing the application? Are you applying your science to my life? We get that question. Who benefits? And if someone wins, does someone lose? And in parts of the country where I work, the same people lose over and over again, right? So what happens if the science says one thing, but we heard about it this morning, the economy, the interests say another? Who wins then, right? These are the kinds of questions that we have to bring a moral and an ethical lens to for these scientific questions. So at the local level, so I run the Gulf Research Program, and as Risa pointed out, this is an endowment that came out of the big oil spill, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010, and the Department of Justice gave the National Academies $500 million in 2013. 30 years to spend all of that money plus its earnings, which gives us about $1 billion conservatively. We have to use that money to bring science and engineering to safer offshore energy, environmental protection, and community health and resilience. What could possibly go wrong, right? 3 easy things. But one of the first things that we realize is that we can't do this alone. So we really focus on partnerships. I'm going to talk a lot about how we work with the people of the Gulf. The questions that we ask, and this really is a draft from the morning keynote, is how do we prepare this next generation of workforce thinkers, scientists, leaders to understand, address, and mitigate the risks to the Gulf. Now, I think everyone here is pretty clear on the risks of the Gulf, but I will go through them kind of quickly. But this question of like looking forward and what's it going to look like for the 15-year-old today who's going to be 35 when my program ends? How do we get those kids ready to deal with what we heard this morning is the end of the world, right? So one is about this energy transition. Oil and gas, I know they cause climate change, I know. But we're not going to flip a switch and go from oil and gas to renewables. So how do we transition through this in a just way, in a safe way and in a way that the United States can retain its energy economic market control. These are important things. So that's one question. Another is about how do we understand and navigate how this dynamic coastline changes, right? In the course of this panel, we're going to lose a couple of acres off Louisiana alone. How do we deal with that over decades? And finally, how do we protect the people? You know, it wasn't mean if people are gone and they can't live there. So how do we get the people to be healthy and resilient? And these are the framings for the questions. I always like to show the Louisiana Purchase, not because I'm a history buff, but because Thomas Jefferson, way back in 1863 or something, said, we want the mouth of that Mississippi in the United States. That's why he bought it. He didn't want Montana necessarily. He wanted the mouth of the Mississippi for commerce and all that comes with the mouth and the delta of a huge river. And this stays all the way to today, right? This is where we work. Now, you guys might be more familiar with the Gulf in terms of record seasons of storms. I love this map. If anything says that there's a problem in the United States and it's right there, it's this one. It's also oil. These are offshore platforms. These are pipelines. This is why our gas costs less than the gas cost in Europe or some of our friends from Japan or New Zealand, Australia, what we heard today. So our work, we work in and across the communities of these 5 states, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida, that arc across the Gulf. And we apply science to improve policy. We work with people, federal agencies, state agencies, CBOs, NGO, community-based organizations, non-governmental organizations. We work on policy, we work on disaster and climate resilience, and we really work on community engagement. I am watching my time. I have 7 minutes and 45 seconds left. Okay, so our role is to engage these communities so that we can be true to our mandate, which is to bring science and engineering, right, to make this part of the world a better place. So the science has to be good. We have to be true to the science. We sometimes hear from people in the region that climate change isn't real. See, well, that's not really true to the science. So we got to be true to the science, but we have to do it in a way that's useful and meaningful for the people who are supposed to benefit from that science. And that's where the ethical and moral piece comes in. All right, I think I'm on my 3rd one now. See, it's going really fast and I'm gonna keep time. Okay, the thing about mitigation that I like, and I like that I'm between David over here and Eric over here who's gonna talk more about mitigation, is that mitigation is forward looking, right? This isn't response. This isn't response and recovery. This is how do we get ready to mitigate for what's coming, right? And so when we think about this, we get to bring in other people. Who's going to be here in 10 years? Who's going to be living there in 20 years, right? And so this is what we do. Okay, so we bring people together. We partner with people. We use science to raise awareness. We have to speak in really clear, unapologetic language sometimes, but it has to be accessible. We can't preach to people. We have to meet them where they are. And we like to take this bigger view that's not just the environment. It's not only, you know, it's not this dichotomy that we often hear about. It's one place. And we got to have an economy, and we have to have an environment, and we got to have some people, and we got to figure it out, right? So we take this bigger, longer view. We pool resources. Now, I do have a lot of money, at least personally. I wish I had this much money. But when you think about it, you know, Hurricane Harvey alone was 25 billion in recovery. I got 500 million over 30 years. It's not that much money, right? So we have to work together. We have to pool these resources, and we have to do it through partnerships. On this forward-looking piece, I just want to say that we work with undergrads. We work with K through 12. We work with vocational schools. We work in graduate programs. I know that I have some early career research fellows in the audience. And raise your hand. I know I have at least one. Got half of Texas A&M over here. You know? So we we're really getting into this workforce to get people to understand that you don't have health and resilience in isolation, and you don't have energy in isolation. We have to think of these together. Okay, these are some of the programs we have that get to this next generation of thinkers and leaders. Happy to discuss at any time. Rob Gazer, Dan Berger, and Sherry Forrest and I are here from the Gulf Research Program. We will answer any question you have. Okay, so the zipper. So do you do this, Lauren, because you're actually part of the federal government, which we're not? Or do you do it bottom up, top down, bottom up? And we do, and the answer is yes, right? So we have the federal level kind of the top of a zipper, and you have the local level kind of the bottom, and the feds bring in like money and law. Law is kind of important, infrastructure, expertise, other resources, and they kind of come down, right? They have to go from the president to the governor to the, it comes down. Keep losing my scarf. Okay, and then on the local side, you know, the federal money and resources can't do anything if they're not grounded in the local side. So what, you gotta know what the problem is. How did that last event actually hit here? You know, what are the needs? Who's getting the money? Who's being left behind? What about our local knowledge? Because we understand which streets flood and which streets don't, no matter what your maps say, right? So that comes up. And so at this zipper, like the teeth of this zipper are things like grants and expertise and awareness on the federal side. Translation of that, capacity to take it. Now we're going to hear about Justice 40 later, but I'll tell you that a lot of the communities we work in, they are so flooded with opportunities for federal money and no capacity to write a decent proposal, right? So how do we get the exchange, the translation, the problem identification? So these are the teeth of this zipper. And when it's working and your zipper actually works, right? It's all nice and neat. And you have the problem ID that came from the bottom, and you have the collaboration, and it all worked out. And at the top on both sides, you guys have solved the problem, right? Now, the thing about a zipper, and anyone with a 3-year-old knows this, the trick is getting that little nugget thing in the bottom of the zipper. Because if you don't, then your zipper's all whacked out, right? And so the little nuggy thing at the bottom, that's the local community. Those are the people who say, we do need your resources, Federal Emergency Management Agency, or National Oceanic Atmospheric, or we need your money, but this is what we need it for. And so we have to, I have 2 minutes left, I'm watching. So we need that to come up together. And the deal is, like, blessed are the peacemakers, right? Somewhere we read that. And the peacemakers are the people who are the zipper pull. That's everyone in this room trying to make this zipper work. And that's where we all come together on this. All right, so last section, 1 minute, 39 seconds left. I got this. Okay, so where we work. This is not an eye test. It's just dark is less desirable than light in this. And so when you look at food insecurity, you look at COVID, you look at poverty, what are the 5 states that are dark, right? Populations at risk, Texas, Louisiana, Florida, right up front. But that's, you know, seems to fly in the face of where people are actually moving, because population's increasing on the coasts, right? So we have this confluence of risks coming in, but you guys know all of that. Disaster losses. I'm so glad I'm between the USGS and FEMA, because FEMA knows that the 5 states, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida, account for some 3/4 of the disaster relief fund. So in the Gulf of Mexico, as the zipper, as we bring in the well-intentioned scientists with the people who this science is supposed to benefit, I will tell you this, there is no shortage of places that have disaster exposure. None. There is no shortage of the needs for mitigation in these areas, because the threat of climate change is a threat multiplier. So 2020 was a terrible season, 7 named storms, 5 hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico. And we started to see this thing of rapidly intensifying hurricanes. Well, this is the thing of the future. That's here to stay. So how do we mitigate for that? There's no shortage of people. People are moving there to the coast. They want a water view. They love the water. And there's no shortage of opportunities to bring in our moral and ethics into this, because we are working in communities that are always left behind. And so like Dr. Applegate said, do we use our science to shorten that gap or to let it grow? That's the question, because you can't keep it as it is. And this is my last slide. All right, we already got the FEMA 75%. Here's the deal. If we figure it out how to do it in the Gulf of Mexico, we might figure it out for the country. And with that, I'll say thank you.
Yeah. All right, let's roll. I never follow the talking points my staff works so hard on. So thank you for the introduction earlier. So I'm Eric Letfin. I'm the Deputy Assistant Administrator for FEMA. So I'm responsible for the pre and post disaster mitigation grant programs and also floodplain management. So these are the mechanisms that help communities become more resilient, the actual funding. So how do we fit within this whole construct here? I love the zipper analogy because I'm going to talk about where I think we fit on the zipper. Real high level, I'm just going to talk about our grant programs. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. We had a session yesterday on building resilient infrastructure in communities, our pre-disaster mitigation grant program. Camille Crane, raise your hand. She's in charge of that program. We have a request for information on how to improve that program. That's what yesterday's session was about. So there's a lot of grant programs across the federal government, and they're usually created by statute. They are created by statute, and then they're modified over time. So some of these programs are brand new. Some of these programs we've had for 30 plus years, and they were written 30 years ago to try to tackle maybe a different set of problems through a different lens than we have today. So it's our job to kind of responsibly manage these programs and make them accessible for communities. So just real quick, hazard mitigation grant program. So those are the dollars that are made available after a disaster. So you have a disaster declaration, like in Puerto Rico after Maria, or Texas after Harvey, Florida after Ian. Those are the dollars that we have to essentially rebuild. Those dollars have been, that program's been out there for 30 plus years. The governor sets the priority for where those dollars go. Let me repeat that. The governor of the state, by law, sets the priorities of where those dollars have gone. Fortunately, we've had some pre-disaster mitigation grant programs, building resilient infrastructure in communities, which replaced our legacy pre-disaster mitigation grant program. We went out when that grant program started and did a big request for information, and equity was one of the foundational pillars of what everyone wanted to see in that program. So we tried to build it from the ground up. We've released the first 2 years worth of awards. We're going to be announcing the third year's awards probably about the second week of August or so. Fortunately, we've seen a fairly substantial increase. Congress understands, when I love the title of this talk, Making the Moral Case for Mitigation. I think we've successfully made the economic case. It took us a while. When I first came to this workshop 20 years ago, maybe we didn't have all that data. We have it now. I think it's fairly well settled. Members of Congress understand the economics of it. Now let's focus on where the dollars are going. Are they going in the right place? So I'll talk a little bit about where the dollars typically go. So roughly, this is our portfolio last year. We obligated a little under $2 billion, and that number is going to keep going up, by the way. And we are hiring like crazy in headquarters and the regions. So if you're interested in coming to work for FEMA, there are a lot of opportunities. I can promise you that. But traditionally, we've spent 75, 80 cents on the dollar post-disaster. So, you need to be hit by a disaster in order to have dollars available. And then the governor sets a priority. Typically, it's a formula. if, Harris County, Texas got 10% of individual and public assistance, they're going to get 10% of the mitigation dollars. That's the way most governors have run that program. And then it's up to, say, Harris County, Texas to determine where that 10% goes within Harris County. That's the way our programs have operated and will continue to operate until Congress tells us otherwise. Pre-disaster, that's a little bit more fun. That's where we have the decision-making authority at headquarters as the White House releases executive orders on nature-based solutions or on Justice 40, we're able to implement a lot of the administration's priorities and FEMA's priorities and feedback that you give us into shaping and reshaping and improving the program over time. So this year, we went from $500 million for building resilient infrastructure in communities to $1 billion to $2.3 billion. Combined with flood mitigation assistance, we're going to be announcing $3 billion of grants in the next few weeks. What's amazing about that is that we were still 2 times oversubscribed. So even though we're talking in the billions, and I've been doing this a long time, we were talking in the 50, 100 million range a decade or two ago. Now we're in the billions. It's still not enough. It's still not enough. And so that's one of my main messages when I talk to members of Congress is, look, you're giving us more money, but the need is growing. And, it's our responsibility to spend those dollars in a timely fashion. That's one of my biggest priorities. It shouldn't take 4 or 5 years to get a grant obligated. And then get those dollars, focusing on equity, focusing on the moral aspects of this. Where are those dollars actually going? So let me talk about that a little bit. Overall, most of our dollars go for flood type projects because, most of our disaster declarations, not all, are flood related. There's a lot of wildfire risk out there, extreme heat, earthquakes. I'll tell you right now, though, we have a lot of work to do in that space. Less than 1% of our grant dollars go for wildfire mitigation. And we all know the risk of wildfires is much greater than that. So we do a pretty good job of funding a lot of municipal flood projects, but we really need a lot of help getting those dollars out there for the right communities. So let me talk about disadvantaged communities a little bit. So as I mentioned, we have the executive order, and I don't want to steal any thunder away from the Justice 40 session tomorrow. I expect that will be well attended, but that executive order said that 40% of the grants, the dollars should go into these disadvantaged communities. So we've been, both our pre-disaster mitigation grant programs, building resilient infrastructure communities, and flood mitigation assistance are part of Justice 40. So I have a report card, part of my performance, part of the agency's performance to the White House and the American public is how well are we executing on those Justice 40 goals? How well are we bringing equity into our programs? So how are we doing that? So in a few weeks, we will be announcing where those dollars are going. And a lot of you, I know Patty for sure, will be looking at where those dollars are going. Where are they going within the states? Within the states, are they going to disadvantaged communities or more wealthy communities of the states? Quite frankly, if we didn't go down this road of equity, again, I've been doing this a long time. When we first ran our pre-disaster mitigation grant programs, we never wanted to give a community an advantage over another. And that's the way we ran it for years. Well, like it's a competition. And between that and where our post-disaster dollars are going, a lot of academics, a lot of you have written articles about this. If we don't focus on equity, our dollars are going to go to wealthy communities who are able to hire consultants, who have the ability to make that cost match, who have the ability to work with USGS and absorb that hazard data. So if we don't focus on equity, I think we pretty much know where the dollars are going to go. They're going to go to the wealthy communities, and that's not making the moral case for mitigation. We have to try to fight that. So what are we doing about that within FEMA? And this is the beginning of a journey, and it's going to be a journey. And every year we're going to make changes and try to improve it. So right now we have direct technical assistance. So I'll show these slides. These are communities where we this year just announced 40 some communities across the entire country where we're providing direct technical assistance. The total number of communities where we're providing direct technical assistance now is over 74 jurisdictions. And we're hoping to double that next year. So what is direct technical assistance? It's simply a community raising their hand saying, we need help. We need help with planning. We need help with grant writing. We need help understanding our risk data. We're interested, we know we have an issue. We don't have the capacity to apply for a grant. So we need help. So what we're committed to at FEMA is helping those communities. We're going out there using contract dollars. We're getting ready. We will be announcing a new contract specifically to support this. Working with our FEMA staff, working with our regions, and going out and helping them and finding out what do they need. Helping them essentially do that work to get them hopefully some funding down the road. Where's Dr. Gavin Smith in our audience? When he introduced himself this morning. So we've employed Dr. Smith through the Coastal Resilience Center to reach out to all of academia. And if you're interested in helping us, helping these communities, this is great work for grad students and postdocs. Please talk to Dr. Smith. So he's trying on our behalf to, we provided funding to bring those in academia who are willing and able to work with these communities, to help them bring dollars and funding. Dr. Smith is going to be helping lead the academic arm of this. So there's a contracting arm, there's an academic arm, there's an arm working with non-governmental organizations. So we're going to keep trying all these different aspects and we're going to see what works, what that secret sauce is. So with the zipper, I think, Lauren, we're at the top of the zipper and we're trying to push dollars and technical expertise down to the bottom of the zipper to communities and trying to figure out what is the best approach, the whole of community, whole of government. How do we work together to change the outcome? The outcome is bringing funding in these communities for projects and planning and capacity building. How are we going to make them more resilient? So we've been given these dollars and funding by Congress, and we have executive orders that are pretty clear on what they expect us to do. And this is our approach for doing that. I do want to talk about, lastly, in closing, talk about benefit cost a little bit. I talked about the economic case. We get beat up a lot for, it's so hard to do a benefit cost. We made a lot of changes to try to make it easier for communities to have a lower benefit cost than technical assistance. We got some approval from the White House to roll some interim things out. We hope to make more permanent. So we are still working in that space because that is still a barrier. We're trying to reduce the barriers for accessing our programs, whether it's benefit cost or technical assistance or grant writing. The tough part of it is the cost match. By law, it is 75-25. 90-10 if you're an economically disadvantaged rural community, and that definition is in statute, essentially 3,000 or less. We were just given some new legislation, the Community Disaster Resilience Zone Act. And Pam, I saw you in the back. Could you raise your hand? I saw you out there earlier. Pam Williams? You better not have snuck out. So Pam and Steve Caruth up here in the front, raise your hand, Steve. They led a session yesterday on Community Disaster Resilience Zone. Essentially what that legislation is saying, once these areas are mapped, they will get a 90-10 cost share for building resilient infrastructure in communities. So I'm unable to change the cost share. This new legislation changes it. So in these newly mapped areas that will come out shortly, communities will have a favorable cost share. And not only that, it directs not just FEMA, but the entire federal government to focus our technical assistance in these mapped areas. These areas are going to have the highest risk and also high social vulnerability. So once those maps come out, that's going to be a roadmap for myself and for David and NOAA, the Corps, other agencies. We have folks here from Small Business Administration, Housing and Urban Development. That's going to be a roadmap for us for working together and focusing all of our technical assistance to helping those highly vulnerable, high-risk communities. So this is a really want to close with, this is where we are now. This is where we're headed. This is a journey, but we have a lot of work to do working with our partners like David and Lauren and Patty to try to take our dollars and work through that zipper analogy and provide the right assistance and funding for communities with the outcome of projects and assistance to help them reduce their risk and reduce disaster suffering. So I will stop there. I'm at time.
We're on. All right. How's everybody doing? Are you having a good day? I'm very pleased to be here. I'm Patty Hernandez with Headwaters Economics, and a huge thank you to Dave, Lauren, and Eric, and Risa, and Lori, and all of you for being here. I'd like to start out by acknowledging that achieving equity and climate adaptation is very difficult because the factors and root causes that create inequities are intertwined. For example, disasters are more common in some places and can definitely be a root cause of poverty in those communities. And then poverty is both a cause and a consequence of lack of access to funding and resources. What we definitely know is that many factors, including policies, have created entrenched pathways and downward spirals for both people and communities. And for example, research has demonstrated multiple times that the more natural hazards accrue, the damages rather that accrue in a place, the more white people tend to accumulate wealth and Black residents tend to lose wealth. And this has been found in national analyses of the outcomes of buyouts, of the outcomes of post-disaster financial assistance. And those pathways that I'm talking about hold true not only for families and individuals, but for communities also. We work with a lot of rural communities, and it's certainly true that rural communities in high hazard areas struggle to access federal grants. And they also struggle to self-fund mitigation activities because they have a very limited tax base. And so funding and access to funding follows these same pathways. And an example of that is that bond ratings are often downgraded following disasters. And that makes it even harder for communities that have high risk to finance mitigation activities. So what can we do? How do we work together to build on these intertwined relationships to reach solutions? How do we respond to this moral imperative to interrupt entrenched pathways? Well, David and Lauren and Eric, they talked about some promising strategies that are being pursued by federal agencies and large science programs. So I'm going to try to round us out, to close us out with a call to action for nonprofits and researchers that are engaging directly with communities on the front lines of climate change. And so that you understand a little bit about where I'm coming from, I'm going to take just a couple quick minutes to introduce Headwaters Economics. So our nonprofit works locally on community development and also nationally on economic policy. And what that looks like in practice is that we frequently partner with local governments to provide data and economic arguments and strategies and tools so that they can do things like pass wildfire-resistant building codes and invest in infrastructure that protects vulnerable neighborhoods from flooding. We are very passionate at Headwaters Economics about improving outcomes in rural and underserved communities that are facing growing challenges from the changing climate and economic transitions. And one accomplishment that we have been celebrating is that we recently learned that actually after a failed attempt at a BRIC grant, and then followed by some technical assistance from FEMA, we helped this community, Three Forks, Montana, secure the largest flood mitigation assistance grant ever awarded to a Montana community. So Headwaters Economics, we've been around for 17 years. We've worked with well over 100 communities on similar projects. And so what I want to do with the remainder of my time is share some strategies that I think are really critical for advancing equity in climate adaptation work, and importantly, realizing outcomes on the ground. The first has already been a theme of this conference, and it's about building relationships. And nonprofits and researchers, we really are first outsiders. And in order to build trust, we have to have an approach that is responsive and not prescriptive. And so I think the story of Glendive, Montana, where we're currently working, really shows why trust building and teamwork is so critical. So this is a community where ice jams are threatening a large mobile home park, and the solutions are complicated with many trade-offs. So what we're looking at in this picture is we are actually looking down the Yellowstone River towards downtown Glendive, and then over to my left, I think it's your left, is the mobile home park that I'm talking about. So you can also see that mobile home park in this photo where there's an ice jam, and you can see that it's only marginally protected by an inadequate levee. So that's that berm of grass that you see. If that is breached by an ice jam, you'll have more than 100 mobile homes that are floating in icy cold water. And if that happens in the middle of the night, the residents may have no warning, and the potential for loss of life is very high. The thing is, this happens a lot in this area. This is a really neat historic picture from the 1899, I believe it is. So the risk is real. And navigating what will likely be a very complicated mobile home buyout and relocation has meant that our team has been building bridges between residents of the mobile home park, the local government, there's an academic institution involved, there's multiple state agencies, multiple federal agencies, and this is the reality of mitigation work. It takes years and more human power than any one organization or agency has to support the difficult work that's underway in communities. And in fact, there's more than 1.5 million people in this country living in mobile homes that are in very high flood risk areas, which is really an indication of the scale and the level of commitment that is needed to address the growing risk from climate-related disasters. The magnitude of the challenge is so big that we certainly, as has been mentioned several times, need all of us, and importantly, the skills that researchers and nonprofits bring to bear. One of those being the ability to put data to work. And of course, communities and agencies are not trying to ignore morality, but they definitely need tools to be able to address it. And these tools, benefit cost analyses have been mentioned several times, need updating so that we're not stuck in a position where we're using metrics to implement policies that are actually at odds with the good that we're trying to accomplish. So having spent years working with rural communities that are struggling to reduce risks from floods and wildfires, our team, both our data analysis and our community liaisons, they got together to produce the first national map of rural capacity, which we published about 18 months ago. And in this map, we included lots of factors representing capacity, just for example, whether local governments have staff in key positions like planners. And we assembled these indicators in order to show where investments are needed to support infrastructure and climate resilience projects. And not surprisingly, we found when we mapped this out that the interior states face far greater capacity barriers. So let me point out a few things on this map. The bright orange areas are the places that face a lot of capacity barriers. The darker places on the map have higher capacity. And what we mean by capacity, because of course you could define it in lots of different ways, but for this mapping project, we're talking about the ability that communities have to plan for and fund and implement and maintain infrastructure that reduces risks from climate-related disasters. One thing I want to note is that because our goal was to map capacity, it looks very different than a social vulnerability map. And that's because there are many at-risk people that live in Boston or New York, Chicago, LA, but those communities really excel at securing federal resources, where many low capacity communities struggle and risk being left behind. On our website, the map is fully interactive, so you can easily get there by Googling rural capacity map. You can hover your mouse over the community to see characteristics. And I'm glad to say it's been very well received. It's being used by state agencies from Michigan to Washington State, federal agencies. NOAA is contributing support to update the map. USDA is actually using it in their outreach efforts and their evaluation of their new bipartisan infrastructure law funded community wildfire defense grants program. So solutions-oriented data projects can absolutely help advance equity in climate adaptation. And because we are a lot of researchers here, the other cool thing about these data projects is that they can surface important questions. Like, for example, what are investments in projects and infrastructure that actually build capacity locally? So I want to get to my third and final section, which has a very common theme here about centering people. And the topic of this morning, the moral imperative, is so fundamental because at the end of the day, we are talking about people's lives. And seeing as how our nonprofit is called Headwaters Economics, I found myself as I was preparing this talk, pondering the relationship between economics and morality. And what I found myself thinking, which Michael in our keynote put much more eloquently, is that if we're talking about realizing the best possible outcomes for all people, we need every tool in the toolbox. So I'm actually going to end the presentation by talking about 3 concepts from economics that I think apply quite well to this moral imperative that we face. So the first one is that bias matters, and behavioral economists talk a lot about the prospect theory. So this is that individuals and governments really struggle to evaluate the threats posed by low probability but high impact events, such as disasters. And in the context of disaster work, this really leads us to look for levers of change, both in terms of policy and practice, essentially nudges that can help shift behavior. And I'm showing a picture of Austin, Minnesota, not Austin, Texas. This city actually did something really clever following a very devastating flood. They put high water markers all over town as a constant reminder and to keep their commitment to reducing flood risk top of mind. The second concept that I want to talk about is specialization. So economists talk a lot about the problems with specialization, and certainly communities on the front lines of climate change are often very specialized in terms of their dependence on farming, mining, tourism, and other boom and bust sectors, meaning that they often lack predictable revenue to invest in mitigation. So in disaster fields, we have to work so hard to understand what solutions actually work on the ground and to share these lessons. So I wanted to show this picture of Taos, New Mexico. they did something very novel, stretching the interpretation of a restrictive state law that dictates that their revenue from their tourism tax has to be spent promoting tourism. Well, Taos insisted that the revenue be spent to reduce wildfire risk, arguing that mitigation is necessary for them to continue hosting tourism. That is a huge win for local adaptation efforts because it is a steady stream of revenue, and it's definitely a strategy worth sharing with other communities. The last concept I'll talk about is interdependence, which in economics is a key aspect of competition and scarcity and occurs between participants in any economic system. And acknowledging interdependence in disaster work really leads us to focus on multi-benefit solutions and that involve lots of partners and interests. So for me, the Marengo River Watershed Project came to mind. This is a collaboration in Wisconsin. And this group of folks, which is a lot of agencies, water conservation districts, local governments, they have achieved flood risk reduction outcomes, they've improved water quality, and importantly, they've invested in protecting resources, including fish spawning habitat and rice beds that are really important to the Chippewa that are part of the Bad River tribe. So I'm just going to end by, of course, reiterating that the scale of the problem is enormous, but I think that we are up to the task. I had the pleasure of spending a good portion of yesterday with fellows from the Bill Anderson Fund. I have this beautiful picture that Nania provided of the group. And these are individuals who are pursuing advanced degrees in engineering, planning, emergency management, and other fields, and are committed to facing disaster-related challenges head on. So I believe we have the courage and the dedication to rise to the challenge, to break free from entrenched pathways. I'm super excited to be here, to be part of this, and to hopefully have an opportunity to work with all of you side by side to be part of the solution. So thank you so much for being here. I'm going to pass it back to Risa. I don't know if we have questions for Q&A, but hopefully. And please, if you don't get a chance to connect with me while I'm here, reach out to me or any of the crew at Headwaters following the meeting.
Thank you. What a fantastic panel. Can I just ask you to thank them all? Or would I said them? And I hope there are questions. You might want to address your question to the individual panelist or to the entire panel. Tell us what you'd like to do. How about this person here?
Good afternoon, Derek Hebert. So there's this question about technical assistance for vulnerable, disadvantaged, underserved, pick your term, communities, but generally speaking, low capacity communities. And there's this idea that we're going to be able to say connect students or academia with these low capacity communities, and they're going to somehow crack the code on getting federal grants. I don't know that that's possible. I'm truly impressed by Headwaters Economics. I followed y'all's work for a number of years, and it's amazing in my opinion. But what I wonder is, what in your experience does it take to be effective in technical assistance to a low capacity community?
All right. That is such a good question. So right now we're trying an experiment. We're working with Lori Peak to host a fellow at the Natural Hazards Center. And the way that we envision this working is that it would be a very close partnership between the postdoc or whoever the young person is and a very experienced person at Headwaters Economics. They would not, the person who is kicking off their career would not be in the community by themselves. It takes years of experience and a lot of know-how with trust building and the use of language and what language to avoid. We work in a lot of very conservative rural communities. That can be something that takes practice. And we want to build the field. And that's absolutely necessary if we're going to realize solutions. So that is one approach that we're trying, because the other thing is that what is true of technical assistance is that it takes time. You don't just helicopter into a community as an outsider, figure out within a week what you can do to be helpful, and then solve the problem and leave in 6 months. We're in communities for years. That means that, there may be students that cycle through phases of a project.
Yeah, I know it's possible because Dr. Gavin Smith has done it, and many others. I know, like Princeville, they've received a BRIC grant already, and that's frankly why we gave Dr. Smith some funding to help figure out what is the art of the possible. So it's been done. We've seen academia on a number of BRIC, building resilient infrastructure in communities applications. I'd love to figure out what is the art of the possible, but I know we can do it, because we have successfully done it before. I haven't, but many of you have.
Either of you want to come? No? Okay, next question is here.
Yeah, so not exactly a question, but a perspective, comment, and a recognition or a request for consideration. First, I work for a state agency, and the decisions about those grant programs, mitigation at the state level, FEMA's programs are managed and implemented by state government agencies. So the governors aren't making the decisions, their authorized representatives who work in those agencies are, and who are often unrecognized, underpaid, understaffed. And then many of your panels talking about the zipper, talking about capacity, those state agencies can either lubricate that zipper or we become a stopping point. If we don't have the capacity, support, and assistance we need, we can create a bottleneck when it comes to federal agencies and national organizations being able to help implement things at the local level. And so I would just ask for anyone who's doing research, make sure state is in there, because state is not local and it's not federal. States are, as our country is made up, those independent organizations that kind of act as middlemen there. So thank you.
Absolutely. So some states that have received a lot of disasters, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act tripled management costs. They doubled it at the state level, and 5% go to the local level. But frankly, I'll be honest, the states, many of them are not using their management costs. We have, and I report this to Congress, over $1.5 billion of unobligated state management costs. So the states, and many of them are using the management costs, but not all of them. Now, some of those dollars, sunset over time, but the Congress tripled the amount of money, for double the amount for states to manage these grants. And by and large, the states, Tom Hughes and others correct me on this, the states by and large are not using all of those dollars.
Can I make a follow-up comment to that statement? So I'm one of those states. Utah does not historically have disasters. I currently have $30-something million in management cost to implement, and I have a staff of 10, because we went from 0 to 100, and our staffing, while we implement FEMA programs, our staffing is determined by our state legislature and by our state politicians. So we have a lot of needs, we have a lot of requests, but we don't have the capacity, even just like locals, the funding is there. The capacity and the approval of our state is not always there to help support that. So money is great, but money without the capacity to implement what you need to is money that's not going to be utilized.
Yeah, and this is a huge problem with windfall funding if there's no guarantee for continuity, whether you're a state agency, a legislature, or a nonprofit. You're reluctant to staff up, not knowing what the future holds.
Hello, I'm Jay Wilson with Clackamas County, Oregon. One of the questions I've had for a number of years, and when it comes to complex problems in areas like we have on the slope of a volcano with very erosive soils, with wildfire hazards, with fish passage issues, is the capacity for federal agencies to be nimble enough to try and bundle grant opportunities between the Corps of Engineers and FEMA, or with HUD, or with the Forest Service. I've had a couple of project ideas and areas where it would take, in order to pull off some of these projects that would require buyouts in conjunction with stream restoration and fish passage, the opportunity to say, how could we do this so that the community can have the capacity to do this all at once, instead of it being this decade-long process? But how nimble are the federal agencies to try and come in and work together to assist the local communities to do this as a one-stop project, instead of something that's going to be tiers and tiers of years? Has that been accomplished, or is there a willingness for that to happen? Is there technical assistance? Are there navigators that have been talked about in the upcoming FEMA Community Disaster Resilience Zonation? I'm asking, is there an appetite for federal agencies to bring that to bear?
Want to talk first, Steve, about SBR?
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, just this. Is this working? It is. Okay. No, this is recognized. This is a significant challenge, and it does speak to the importance of federal coordination happening at multiple levels, not multiple levels of government, but multiple levels within the agencies. And so, where we're typically involved from the standpoint of that technical assistant aspect, we're pulled in as opposed to the granting entity. But where I have seen that working effectively, it is because at that, whether it's a regional level or area level, those agencies are building that connective tissue because the bureaucracy. I know there's a session later on about the challenge of bureaucracy when it comes to recovery, and so I think there'll be much more said about that. But that is, we work to try to build connectivity across the agencies at the headquarters level. But really, when it comes to those sort of from an individual grant standpoint, it comes down to a willingness and a desire to collaborate. Bureaucracy doesn't make it easy. We meet at the president, right? Our entities.
Yeah, and I chair the Mitigation Framework Leadership Group. That's where all the agencies that do mitigation, we come together, hold quarterly meetings. So we have some representatives. Where's Allie in the room? Allie's waving her hand right there. So one of the initiatives that we just launched is a mitigation portal that'll hopefully make it easier for local governments to navigate all of our programs. It's something it's a common complaint we hear. We know we have to do better. All of our agencies put out money at different times with different funding restrictions, and you're simply trying to solve a project at the local level. So through our Mitigation Framework Leadership Group, hopefully through this new portal that we're creating, working through our regional offices, it's an area that we continue to try to improve, but we still have a ways to go, to be honest.
So one thing that is very useful to know is that to some extent, it's happening. There is something that my heroes at Montana Disaster Emergency Services, the state agency that was helping us with that Three Forks project, turned us on to, which was that once we went through FEMA technical assistance, had a really beautiful proposal, we submitted it to BRIC, and it was the same application to flood mitigation assistance. So of course, those are two FEMA programs, but I had no idea that you could submit the same proposal. And I don't know how many of the folks that have, gotten into college recently filled out what is it called? The common application. I'm like, yes, let's do that. It's between schools, like it is possible. So maybe there can be some future traction and discussion on having some more common elements between federal proposals.
I'm not seeing hands. Please, yes. Okay,
I'll happily pass the mic right after. One of the things that I took away from this morning's keynote was the importance of naming the morality, or rather naming the immorality, right? And so many of your presentations talked about disparate outcomes by race and income, yet your programs are limited in your ability to talk about race in particular. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the challenges at the federal level that are statutory, as well as current administration's executive orders around race, and how you're dealing at the state level with some states that are potentially backwards in this conversation.
Thank you for that question, because it's a hard one, and I won't talk about the federal piece, but I'll talk about some of the state level pieces. So everyone probably is aware that last week or 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court handed down a ruling around affirmative action in Texas, Senate Bill 99, in Florida, House Bill 999. These bills in Texas and in Florida explicitly restrict, you can't, everyone knows the Florida one, you can't say gay, that one. But you also can't say like diversity, you can't say equity, you can't use these words. Texas was similar, not quite as restrictive as Florida. And so those are the laws of the land now, right? And in the Gulf Research Program, we work in these 5 states. We have a really big thrust on community engagement. We have a really big thrust on equity. We have a really big thrust on climate. We have a really big thrust on education. And these things start to coalesce around these terms we increasingly cannot say. We had a few schools in the state of Florida who withdrew their application. It was really heartbreaking. They withdrew their applications to the Gulf Research Program because our call for these funding opportunities were around equity. And they were like, we can't do that. We are withdrawing. One of the applications was for one of these long-standing institutional capacity building programs to make sure that we are building this future workforce that is reflective of the place where we work. So it's a really big challenge. I don't have a great answer of how we're going to do it at the state and local level. I mean, I work in Washington with the feds. It's pretty easy to work with the feds from where I sit. That's not the case for a lot of the communities in the states where I work, though. So it's a really difficult thing. And I guess I would also just say that we are combing through what that affirmative, and the affirmative action thing doesn't really hit us directly. It's so narrowly written, but the expectation is that there will be massive ripple effects coming from that. That has a huge impact on who's going to go to school, who can afford to go to school, who's going to get into these, where it's already hard enough. And we're combing through the state laws at this point too, expecting Louisiana to come online with a proposal that looks a lot like Texas and Florida. So we're going to come through it and see where we can land, where we can be true to our mission, true to the science, and not go to jail.
I'll chime in with one quick thing that is hopeful, which is as nonprofits and researchers that are invited to work in communities, which we work in many politically conservative communities, we build trust, we show that we're useful, and then we're in this lovely position to get the right people at the table. And that is something that we can do. We all have the ability to do that once we've built the relationships.
Again, I'm going to ask you to thank the panel for the wonderful presentation.
Dave, Lauren, Patty, Eric, and Risa, thank you so much for this opening panel and for the anchor that you have provided for us for the remainder of this workshop. We are deeply grateful for each of you. And now to all of you who are still in this room, I have a few announcements before we take a break. So number one, If you have not yet contributed to the community mural, we hope that you will share what you have been inspired by, what you're learning, and what you are thinking about moving forward as you continue to hear these remarks and from these extraordinary speakers. If you have handouts or other materials that you wish to share with participants at this workshop, there is room in